Venezuela is under siege by the brutal, illegitimate dictatorship that rules it. But opposition leader María Corina Machado has a vision to restore national sanity. And today she joins Democracy Dialogues to tell us what it is. I'm your host, Eric Farnsworth. A nation that was once democratic is now a police state. Once Latin America's wealthiest country, Venezuela is an economic basket case. A quarter of the population has already fled, some 8 million people. And after the latest stolen elections on July 28th, still more are calling it quits. Since then, the regime headed by Nicolás Maduro has intensified oppression and abuse. It's kidnapping opposition leaders and laymen alike, openly harassing opposition supporters, including top vote-getter Edmundo González. Hope for change on the street has methodically been replaced by fear. Some 25 protesters have already been killed as of now, and over 1,500 more have been disappeared into the inhumane Venezuelan gulag. A nation at the geographic center of the hemisphere has collapsed, pulling in all its neighbors. Meanwhile, the international community seems impotent in the face of determined repression. Into this vortex has stepped my guest today, Nobel Peace Prize nominee María Corina Machado. Though barred by the regime from running for president, she is a voice of hope who has galvanized a movement for change that decisively chose President-elect González over Cuban and Putin-backed dictator Maduro. María Corina Machado, welcome to Democracy Dialogues.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's a pleasure.
Things in Venezuela seem to be getting darker by the day. What gives you hope to carry on?
Well, things are accelerating in Venezuela every day, and certainly it's a moment of great risks and challenges, but my hope and my trust and confidence comes from knowing our people's commitment to freedom and the way we have fight and organized to achieve this point. We've come a very long way in the last 18 months with a succession of concrete victories that put us in a point where I think it's a moment where we've been stronger in relative terms to the regime in 25 years.
What you and the Venezuelan people are doing is truly historic. It's also personally costly. Can you give us a sense outside of Venezuela, some of the restrictions that the regime has put you under and your family? Tell us a little bit what some of these issues are.
Wow, that's a long list. Not only for me, but for today, almost anyone who decides to speak out. Look, we carry an election, a campaign that's unique. I mean, history will make several case studies out of it because we proved that you can be successful against a tyranny, even if you don't have the media, if you don't have money at all, even if you are persecuted, even if your campaign team is either in prison or under protection in an embassy. If you can manage to turn this into a social movement with people are absolutely inspired and committed around common values. And that's exactly what we did. So today it's a very hard moment for us. We thousands of our team members are in hiding. Tens are in prison. Dozens are in prison at this moment. Many have had to leave the country. And certainly the regime is trying to produce fear and paralyze everyone. But believe me, the organization and the will to fight is stronger than ever, here and also abroad with the Venezuelan diaspora.
You know, since July 28th, since the stolen elections of July 28th that clearly showed Edmundo González as the victor, the international community has demanded that the regime of Nicolás Maduro release the actas, the vote totals. Of course, the regime refuses to do so, and we can predict that that will continue to be the case. But in the wake of continued regime intransigence, refusal to do so, continuation of abuse, what specifically would you call on the international community to do to help the process of democratization in Venezuela?
Well, I think it's time to move forward in a new phase. I mean, this was a very important demand that the international community did immediately after, without a single number or a single tally sheet published. The Electoral Council announced Maduro had won. We were able in 24 hours to collect, digitalize, and publish over 25,000 tally sheets. That's over 80% of the total, which was huge. I mean, this was an operation in which we had over 1 million volunteers throughout the country, people that organized in their communities, that protected the voting centers. Even we had cooperation from members of the armed forces that were deployed all over Venezuela, and by employees of the Electoral Council that disobeyed the orders not to give our witnesses the tally sheet. So this was huge. And there have been over 20 independent studies and reports from the Carter Center, from the United Nations, from the Washington Post, from Associated Press, from the University of Michigan and Berkeley. You know, where they affirm that our actas, our tally sheets, the one we publish, are authentic. So the world knows Edmundo González is the president-elect, and Maduro was defeated by a landslide. I understand that at some point, the pressure was for the regime to actually publish the results as the law states in Venezuela, but they are not going to do it because the results would prove that we win. So I think it's certainly come to a point in which we need to move ahead, as I say, and this is a moment in which Edmundo González should be recognized as president-elect of Venezuela.
So beyond that, because the regime is clearly trying to insist that that's not the case, what sort of leverage would you call on the international community to use to try to encourage this result that we all seek?
Well, that's this is a tough moment, certainly,
Yeah.
And I know many people abroad, and they tell me once, over and over again, it's impossible to succeed. But that's what I've been hearing for years. That's what I heard a year and a half ago, that it was impossible to bring back, enthusiasm and energy and unite Venezuela. And we did it. And then they said it was impossible to carry out primaries without the interference of the regime. And we did it. We had almost 3 million people voting in the primaries. And then they said it was going to be impossible to have an election with a candidate that represented the democratic forces, who was Edmundo González and who is now president-elect. And we did it. And then they said it was impossible to prove fraud. And we did it. So this is a moment in which certainly we are facing a very hard moment because the regime understands that they have been defeated. We defeated them socially, spiritually, politically, and with the votes. Now, Maduro is asserting his options. I believe he's making a wrong assertion because they still feel that the cost of staying in power is lower than the cost of leaving power. And that is not the case. And it's going to be, more and more costly every day that goes on to stay in power, not only because they stole an election and everybody knows that, but because they decided to unleash the worst repression wave we've seen in Venezuelan history. And it's been recorded, it's been denounced. The Inter-American Commission said it could be qualified as state terrorism. And this is something that is isolating them every day that goes by. He's weaker and weaker every time he restores to violence.
It's interesting you mentioned the word terrorism. It's come up recently that perhaps designating Venezuela as a state sponsor of terror could be something that at least the United States might consider. Your points are very, very well made, and as you say, it's a very difficult and evolving situation. In August, you personally and others in the Venezuelan opposition leadership called for massive public protests throughout Venezuela and indeed throughout the world. And those materialized. Millions of people, it seems, came to the streets, at least hundreds of thousands. So first of all, congratulations to mobilize such a global movement for democracy in Venezuela. The question I would have for you is, how do we sustain that? I mean, the regime is clearly using violence to put down against defenseless people. Over 27 people have already died and hundreds have been put into prison in horrible conditions. How do you sustain those public protests, and how can the international community support that as well?
Well, Eric, as you know, we were not surprised by a reaction of this magnitude. Perhaps, people never thought he would detain massively children as they have done. No, and that's something that horrified everyone. But Maduro had said that he would stay by force, that before, and that the bloodshed would come to Venezuela. So no one can be surprised, because these guys are criminals. So the thing here is that we have a strong strategy that we have been deploying successfully, and we have been anticipating what the regime could do, and they are committing mistakes. Believe me, some people believe that they always have considered all conditions and always are victors. That's not true. They have committed many mistakes, and I believe today they are completely out of touch with reality. And I think that's a sign of regimes when start to cram down, to crack down. And certainly we need to be creative and adaptive to these actions from the regime. But as you say, we have managed to turn Venezuela into a true global cause. And this is something very, very important. We are going to maintain, we need to strengthen that. And we have a huge diaspora, more than 8 million Venezuela that are abroad. Most of them want to come back home. And they will, as soon as we go ahead with the transition to democracy. And they are our voices nowadays. So you will see how we create and develop more and more actions that work in different layers, not only mobilizing locally, which we will still do with intelligence and cautious, but we will do that around the world as well.
One of the things that you mentioned really caught my ear, the idea that you've won the spiritual battle with regard to the regime. This is a really fundamentally important point. I'm really glad you raised it. This idea that the opposition is correct, not just in terms of winning votes, but is correct in terms of what your vision is for Venezuela. And I just wonder, that is a very powerful thing to change hearts and minds. The only people really that can defend Maduro at this stage are those who are, have a specific interest perhaps in the continuation of brutality in the regime. But at the end of the day, that changes hearts and minds, but it doesn't change governments. And I wonder, this is what we struggle with in Washington and elsewhere around the world. How do you get to that point where, another thing you mentioned, the regime recognizes that the costs of staying in power exceed the costs of leaving power? How do you change that dynamic? Is there something that you would tell us in terms of how we should be thinking about those very important issues?
Yeah, absolutely. But you cannot change a country that has gone through so much devastation if you are not able to heal and unite around common values. I mean, ours has been a movement of redemption for liberation. This is very powerful. If you stay and you address what's going on in Venezuela from an electoral perspective, then you stay in the surface. What's going is very profound. I believe we are closing a political cycle and starting a new era. And that has cultural implications, as well as a totally new relation between the state and citizens, even different from what we had before Chavez. So, as I say, this is huge, and this is unstoppable. I cannot tell you how long it will take, hours, days, weeks, but this will take place. The most time it takes place and it happens, the more damage it makes, not only to Venezuela, but also to the region. We're already seeing how the number of people fleeing our country is increasing dramatically as we speak. And if you prolong this agony, you could have 2, 3, 4, 5 million Venezuelans leaving, and many will be in the south border of the US. And that's something we certainly don't want to happen. And we can avoid that from happening. And so the first thing is that you have to understand what's the nature of this regime, and thus understand what are the incentives that truly work. So right now, Maduro feels that he can actually kill people, disappear people, detain people, and nothing would happen. That the cost of doing that is zero. And that is not true. I mean, he has to be held accountable for the crimes he has committed. And he has to understand that the world will not simply look the other way around, which is what happened before. So they think that, in a couple of weeks or days or months, whatever, something else will happen in the world, and the world will forget about Venezuela. And that will not happen. They will not divide us or prevent us from doing what we have to do. I mean, we will never surrender. And I want to tell the world that we've never had a better opportunity to make this a successful transition to democracy, to solve the most important conflict, not only for the security of the hemisphere, but the national security of the United States as the one as we have right now. These opportunities too.
Yeah, your points are extraordinarily well made, and the idea of impunity is fundamental. They have to realize that even if the attention of the world goes to some other issue, that there will be accountability for crimes, even at the highest level. That's a really important point. The idea that self-interest should also be driving some of the international response. No, you referenced the migration crisis that isn't just for the United States. It's Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, some of the countries in the Caribbean. These countries are being directly affected, Panama. So even the idea of just simply self-interest, you would think that perhaps there could be a stronger response.
That's why this time is different, Eric. Yeah. And that's a critical point you are saying, because for the first time, all the interests of stakeholders, of different stakeholders, are aligned in the same direction. And I'm not only talking about the international community, governments on one side of the other, in the ideological side. I'm talking about creditors, oil companies, financial sector, NGOs, human rights offenders. Every single actor that has interests in Venezuela should understand that their personal, individual interests are now aligned with an orderly transition to democracy. I would even say even Maduro's interest, Eric, because every day that goes by, he's sinking deeper and deeper, and his negotiation status is deteriorating every day that goes by. And we have said that we're willing to go into a negotiation for transition to democracy, and we're willing to give guarantees. But every day that goes by, his relative position with us is worse. It's deteriorating.
Yeah. The longer he hangs on, the worse the ultimate deal for him is. Maria Corina Machado, I know that your time is not unlimited. Unfortunately, you have other things going on. You're extraordinarily busy. I have one final quick question for you. And I just thank you so much for taking time to visit with us here at Democracy Dialogues. if you had a crystal ball, what would you predict as the path forward for Venezuela? I mean, you're fighting, you're pushing the Venezuelan people, the world, if I could say, is behind your efforts. You've been nominated even for a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, the question is, what's the path forward here, and where do we end up?
Well, I would say it's a long path,
Yeah.
because it goes beyond changing the regime. It has to be also building a very, very, strong societies with, ethical pillars. We've learned so much as a society during these last 25 years to value having our children home, to value being able to speak out, to travel around your country. I mean, I think that our generation is the generation better prepared ever to rebuild the country around these values of freedom, democracy, prosperity, honesty, honest work. And I think it's going to be a complex transition, because it's a country without institutions. We have a huge humanitarian crisis, as well as security crisis, public services crisis, financial crisis. We need to build trust among us, and that's perhaps the most important thing that we've done so far. The most important asset we have so far is how we've been building trust among citizens, and then we will have to build trust towards institutions, so that we can have huge investments coming into Venezuela, and we will turn our country in the energy hub of the Americas. We will be a reliable partner for Western democracies, but also we will be a reliable partner fighting for security and freedom and stability in the region. So I think we're facing an incredible moment in history. I think it is the most important conflict taking place in the Western Hemisphere. And I think it should get all that attention and priority from not only democratic governments, from the people, from the people that truly believe in these values. And believe me, we will prevail, Eric. Venezuela will be free, and we will bring our kids back home.
Venezuela will be free someday, and hopefully very, very soon. What a powerful vision and powerful work that you're doing. Again, it's historic. We are with you, and we don't just encourage you, but we stand with you in full solidarity. So thank you for taking the time, joining us again here at Democracy Dialogues. María Corina Machado from Caracas, Venezuela, fighting for a renewal of democracy in a very, very troubled country, but one with a very bright future, hopefully. Thank you again for joining us. And thanks to all of you for joining us here at Democracy Dialogues, where we come to you on the first Thursday of every month. Join us at our website, www.as-coa.org, or on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. And until then, please remember to work together to ensure that democracy delivers for all of us.